The word knight usually brings to mind a spotless Hollywood hero, bravely riding to rescue a beautiful, captive princess. You always imagine a shining champion straight out of a classic Disneyland fairy tale, draped in absolute flawless glory. But the harsh, brutal reality of wearing that heavy steel armor is far from a romanticized silver screen fantasy. Instead of a noble savior, you are actually just a desperate man suffocating under massive mountains of crushing debt. You find yourself completely trapped inside a dark metal cage that perpetually reeks of your own sour, anxious sweat. Open your eyes to a completely freezing, miserable dawn in the 14th century. The biting morning frost violently pierces right through your thin linen undershirt. You stand shivering violently inside a dark, damp, and incredibly drafty canvas tent. The ground beneath your freezing bare feet is nothing but hardened, unforgiving mud. A thick, grey fog completely swallows the sprawling encampment just outside your door. You can distinctly hear the rhythmic clinking of heavy metal hammers striking anvils. The air around you is thick with a genuinely foul, sickening stench. It smells powerfully of burning wood, mixed heavily with unwashed, exhausted human bodies. Your loyal servant silently drags a massive wooden chest across the dirt floor. He pulls out thick padded garments smelling strongly of old grease and stale blood. You watch closely as pieces of dull grey steel are laid out meticulously. The cold iron plates clatter aggressively against each other with a sharp, unforgiving ringing. This is not a majestic ceremony filled with glorious singing and waving banners. It is a grim, highly mechanical process of preparing a human for brutal slaughter. The rough wool padding violently scratches your skin as it is forcefully pulled down. Next comes the incredibly heavy chainmail that instantly crushes your tired, aching shoulders. Every single metallic ring bites coldly into your flesh like tiny, freezing teeth. You struggle simply to draw a full breath under the rapidly increasing physical weight. Outside the fragile tent, the frantic shouting of exhausted men echoes through the camp. You swallow hard while tasting the bitter metallic tang of fear in your mouth. A squire firmly buckles a solid steel breastplate tightly across your severely restricted chest. The thick leather straps are pulled so aggressively that your lungs genuinely protest. This armor is supposedly designed to protect your life on the chaotic battlefield. Yet it already feels exactly like a heavy tomb slowly closing around your body. You stare blankly at the muddy ground while trying to calm your racing heart. The deafening war horns begin to blow ominously in the incredibly dense grey distance. Every single piece of this equipment represents years of desperate saving and grueling sacrifice. So how exactly did you end up here inside this incredibly heavy steel armor? You are barely 22 years old and extremely hungry for a completely different life. The prestigious title of knight sounds like a glorious golden ticket to absolute elite status. You desperately wanted to escape the miserable, mud-stained poverty of your obscure family estate. But the bitter, undeniable truth is that glory requires a massive, almost unimaginable upfront investment. Becoming a respected knight is not a magical blessing granted gently by a noble king. It is a grueling, ruthless financial transaction that chains you to a mountain of obligations. As your young, inexperienced squire harshly yanks another thick leather strap, your mind naturally races. You are absolutely not thinking about heroic tales or beautiful maidens waiting to be saved. You are desperately calculating the terrifying, overwhelming cost of every single piece of polished metal. This foggy, miserable morning in France is freezing, but you sweat from pure financial panic. You secured a massive, risky loan against your family's very last piece of fertile land. If you fail today, your entire bloodline will be completely ruined for many long generations. That gleaming steel breastplate pressing tightly against your lungs is your biggest agonizing financial nightmare. It cost the exact equivalent of a massive lifelong mortgage on a beautiful grand estate. You did not just buy a piece of protective gear for this exceptionally bloody war. You effectively borrowed against your own future to wear this suffocating, incredibly heavy metal prison. Every single time a cheap enemy arrow strikes your chest, your racing heart completely stops. You are not afraid of dying from the blunt impact of the fast wooden shaft. You are absolutely terrified because fixing a minor dent costs 3 months of your salary. How can a desperate man fight bravely when his armor is a walking financial crisis? Your trembling hand rests heavily on the beautifully crafted pommel of your expensive long sword. Bards sing romantic songs about magical blades, forged by ancient, highly skilled and legendary masters. The harsh truth is much more depressing and heavily tied to ruthless medieval market economics. This sharpened weapon represents a deeply agonizing line of credit you can barely even afford. The high-carbon steel had to be imported from very expensive, highly dangerous foreign routes. You practically starved yourself for an entire year just to afford the highly polished scabbard. But the absolute worst financial drain is standing quietly outside the damp, freezing canvas tent. Your massive warhorse, the legendary Destria, is snorting aggressively in the incredibly thick morning fog. This beast is not a loyal, affectionate pet that you lovingly feed sweet red apples. It is a terrifyingly expensive, highly specialized vehicle that constantly drains your painfully empty purse. Purchasing this aggressive animal cost as much as a luxurious, high-end, modern imported sports car. Furthermore, this completely ungrateful beast consumes vast quantities of highly expensive imported grain every day. You spend significantly more money feeding your angry horse than you spend feeding your brothers. A terrifying disaster strikes if this fragile, heavily financed animal simply breaks a delicate leg. A sudden, fatal fever in this miserable, completely freezing French mud would ruin everything immediately. Your entire violent startup venture would violently collapse before you even draw your expensive sword. You are essentially a desperate entrepreneur carrying the crushing weight of impossible daily overhead costs. Every swing of an enemy axe threatens to completely shatter your highly fragile financial foundation. You must capture rich enemies just to pay off the enormous interest on your loans. You are just a debt-ridden hustler trapped inside a shiny, incredibly expensive, highly polished shell. Your aging father completely drained his meager life savings to fund this deeply desperate gamble. He looked you directly in the eyes and begged you to bring home tremendous wealth. Those desperate words echo loudly inside your heavy, suffocating helmet on this utterly miserable morning. You cannot simply ride away and escape this crushing burden of immense, unforgiving societal expectation. The ruthless creditors back home are far more terrifying than any armed French soldier here. The beautiful, shiny armor suddenly feels exactly like a tightly locked, incredibly heavy iron coffin. You finally realize that you are not a legendary hero defending the weak and innocent. You are a heavily leveraged military contractor trying desperately to break even on a battlefield. Every single step you take in the mud is driven by pure, agonizing financial panic. The glorious songs of chivalry are just clever, highly deceitful marketing campaigns to hide reality. You must fight like a vicious, bloodthirsty demon just to survive the ruthless debt collectors. Will you actually manage to pay off this massive, suffocating mountain of terrifying medieval debt? But the real secret is that the physical armor is not your only heavy constraint. Hollywood movies always show heroes casually slipping into shiny armor as easily as wearing a simple leather jacket. The miserable historical reality of preparing for battle requires a highly specialized team of dedicated, exhausted assistants. You begin this claustrophobic transformation by forcing yourself into a thick, incredibly heavy padded garment called a gambeson. This dense jacket is tightly stuffed with coarse horsehair, old wool, and thick layers of unforgiving linen. It immediately traps your natural body heat while instantly restricting the natural, fluid movement of your tired shoulders. Breathing already feels noticeably shallower as the stiff, quilted fabric aggressively presses against your rapidly expanding chest. You are essentially wearing a highly compressed, incredibly heavy winter mattress directly against your rapidly sweating skin. Next comes the deeply agonizing, brutally heavy layer of thousands of interlocking iron rings known as chainmail. Your squire struggles intensely to lift this massive 50-pound metal shirt over your severely restricted, aching head. The cold, unforgiving steel rings immediately drag your exhausted shoulders downward with an absolutely crushing, relentless gravitational pull. Every single tiny movement you attempt suddenly requires twice as much physical effort and significant mental concentration. The rough metal violently scrapes against the padded gambeson while simultaneously biting deeply into your heavily strained neck. You stand completely rigid as your assistants meticulously tie heavy leather laces to secure the heavy mail gussets. Your physical freedom is systematically stolen away, with every single tightly knotted leather cord and heavy iron ring. The most iconic and suffocating part of this agonizing daily ritual involves the gleaming, solid steel plates. Your squires begin carefully strapping highly rigid metal greaves directly onto your rapidly aching, completely exhausted lower legs. Cold steel cuisses are forcefully buckled around your thighs, completely eliminating your ability to bend your knees naturally. Heavy leather straps dig aggressively into your sensitive flesh as the solid metal cuirass encloses your tight chest. You are suddenly trapped entirely inside a custom-built, perfectly tailored, incredibly expensive walking steel coffin without any windows. Reaching up to scratch a simple itch on your sweating face becomes an absolute, physically impossible, logistical nightmare. The sheer physical exhaustion of merely standing upright inside this rigid shell drains your precious, limited daily energy. The meticulous process continues as heavy steel pauldrons are violently strapped onto your deeply aching, heavily bruised shoulders. Your arms are systematically encased inside rigid metal vambraces that completely restrict the bending of your tired elbows. Your assistant forces your trembling hands into highly articulated, extremely heavy steel gauntlets lined with thick, sweaty leather. These metal gloves severely cripple your fine motor skills, making the simple act of gripping incredibly difficult. You cannot easily adjust your own belt or wipe the freezing morning sweat from your completely exhausted brow. Every single metallic joint loudly squeaks and aggressively grinds together whenever you attempt the slightest physical movement. You feel exactly like a completely paralyzed prisoner, hopelessly trapped inside a rigid, unforgiving medieval torture device. The final, terrifying stage of your metallic imprisonment happens when the heavy steel helmet descends over your head. The surrounding medieval world instantly shrinks to a tiny, incredibly narrow slit of heavily restricted, blurry forward vision. You can hear nothing except the extremely loud, terrifyingly rapid thumping of your own desperate, echoing heartbeat. The stale, sour air inside the tight visor quickly becomes unbearably hot and heavily saturated with your sweat. You cannot turn your neck freely without rotating your entire, massively weighed-down torso in one stiff, awkward motion. You are effectively cut off from all normal human senses while standing completely immobilized in the freezing mud. But the incredibly heavy, suffocating steel armor is absolutely not the only terrifying thing heavily binding you today. You quickly realize that a heavily armored knight absolutely never travels alone across the dangerous medieval countryside. You are essentially the highly stressed CEO of a remarkably fragile, heavily armed, medieval startup company. Operating this shiny steel machinery requires a surprisingly large, highly specialized team of dedicated full-time employees. You must permanently employ a highly skilled squire, a dedicated stable groom, an energetic young page, and an experienced master blacksmith. Every single one of these deeply essential workers constantly looks directly to your suspiciously empty purse for their daily physical survival. You're no longer just a simple warrior, but rather an exhausted manager of a highly complex logistical enterprise. This extensive personal entourage represents a terrifying, absolutely massive overhead cost that completely drains your deeply borrowed capital. Each specialized employee strictly demands generous daily food rations, warm winter clothing, and a completely reliable monetary salary. If your severely underpaid blacksmith suddenly quits in absolute frustration, your entire sophisticated military operation instantly grinds to a devastating halt. You spend countless agonizing hours desperately managing complicated human resources instead of practicing your elite battlefield combat skills. The glorious tales of chivalrous adventure completely conveniently leave out the crushing, relentless daily burden of agonizing medieval middle management. You lie awake at night desperately calculating the rapidly shrinking amount of silver left in your small leather pouch. Furthermore, you absolutely cannot participate in a prolonged military campaign relying upon just one single animal. You desperately require a surprisingly large, incredibly expensive logistical fleet just to move your heavy equipment around. You must aggressively purchase stubborn pack mules to carry your heavy canvas tents and essential daily cooking supplies. You also need a comfortable, smooth-riding palfrey horse, strictly for traveling extremely long distances across uneven, thoroughly muddy roads. Your primary warhorse is carefully preserved and vigorously protected purely for the extremely brief, highly dangerous moments of actual combat. Maintaining this massive, highly demanding logistical supply chain creates an absolutely terrifying daily cash burn rate. Providing adequate nutrition for these massive, heavily muscled warhorses costs an absolute fortune in a completely barren war zone. These elite military animals consume vast quantities of highly expensive, heavily imported high-protein grain every single day. You watch helplessly as your extremely limited, highly leveraged venture funds vanish rapidly into the cold mud like melting winter snow. The crushing financial pressure of simply keeping your massive team fed completely shatters any remaining romantic battlefield illusions. You are essentially paying exorbitant premium prices for basic survival necessities in a highly inflated, heavily monopolized war economy. You are aggressively bleeding precious, irreplaceable capital every single hour you spend waiting in this miserable military encampment. Surviving this grueling financial nightmare requires significantly more than just raw physical strength and expensive steel armor. You must aggressively seek out wealthy patrons and secure highly lucrative military contracts to avoid absolute, total bankruptcy. But how exactly does a desperate, debt-ridden soldier successfully network with the most powerful elite nobles of the realm? The deeply uncomfortable answer will completely change how you fundamentally view the glamorous concept of medieval high society. You step outside the damp tent and immediately face the agonizing reality of your military enterprise. A solitary knight wandering the peaceful countryside is nothing but a completely fictional, highly romanticized myth. Operating this incredibly heavy steel machinery demands a surprisingly large team of highly dedicated medieval employees. You are essentially the highly stressed founder of a remarkably fragile, heavily armed medieval startup company. You must permanently employ a highly skilled squire, a dedicated stable groom, and an experienced blacksmith. You also critically need a specialized armorer to constantly repair your easily damaged, incredibly expensive plates. Every single one of these highly essential workers looks directly at you for their daily survival. These demanding specialized employees require generous daily food rations, warm winter clothing, and completely reliable salaries. You spend countless agonizing hours desperately managing complicated human resources instead of practicing combat skills. This extensive personal entourage creates an absolutely massive overhead cost that completely drains your borrowed capital. If your severely underpaid blacksmith suddenly quits in absolute frustration, your entire military operation fails. Furthermore, you absolutely cannot possibly participate in a prolonged military campaign relying upon just one animal. You desperately require a surprisingly large, incredibly expensive logistical fleet just to strictly transport heavy equipment. You must constantly purchase highly stubborn pack mules to carry your heavy canvas tents and supplies. You also critically need a comfortable palfrey horse, strictly for traveling extremely long distances across roads. Your utterly exhausted servants must continuously load and successfully unload these heavily burdened carts daily. The glorious tales of chivalrous adventure conveniently leave out this crushing, relentless burden of middle management. Your incredibly expensive primary warhorse is carefully preserved purely for the extremely brief, dangerous combat moments. This legendary destrier is a terrifyingly expensive transportation vehicle that constantly drains your painfully empty purse. Purchasing this aggressive, highly trained medieval animal cost almost exactly as much as a modern supercar. The massive war horse strictly requires highly specialized steel armor that easily doubles your staggering debt. Maintaining this highly demanding creature creates an absolutely terrifying, completely relentless daily cash burn for you. These elite military animals rapidly consume vast quantities of highly expensive imported grain every single day. You watch utterly helplessly as your extremely limited venture funds vanish rapidly into the freezing mud. The crushing financial pressure of simply keeping your massive team fed completely shatters any romantic illusions. You are essentially paying exorbitant premium prices for basic survival necessities in a highly inflated economy. Local merchants absolutely ruthlessly overcharge desperate traveling knights for simple items like horseshoes and medicine. You are aggressively bleeding precious, completely irreplaceable capital every single agonizing hour you spend waiting here. Surviving this grueling financial nightmare requires significantly more than just raw physical strength and heavy armor. How long can you realistically sustain these impossible overhead costs before your entire venture collapses? But the real secret is that this crushing financial pressure inevitably forces you into unfamiliar territory. You finally step away from the freezing mud and enter the suffocatingly hot, brilliantly lit Great Hall. This grand feast is essentially a mandatory, highly stressful networking event for desperate, deeply indebted medieval professionals. The air feels incredibly thick with the overwhelming scent of roasted meats and aggressively strong, cheap perfumes. Nobles loudly boast about fictional achievements while aggressively drinking highly spiced, incredibly expensive imported sweet wines. You stand completely stiff in the corner, quietly observing this thoroughly toxic, highly competitive social hierarchy. Every single smile here completely hides a desperate, calculating agenda, driven entirely by pure financial survival panic. You quickly notice a highly respected veteran named Sir William, standing uncomfortably near the massive stone fireplace. He is 45 years old and considered an incredibly seasoned professional in this extremely violent, unforgiving industry. Instead of his heavy armor, he wears ridiculously tight, brightly colored silk garments, restricting his normal breathing. This highly impractical, profoundly uncomfortable velvet outfit is the strict, mandatory corporate uniform of the medieval elite. He must constantly project an image of effortless wealth, despite secretly drowning in massive, unpayable campaign debts. The aggressive, highly demanding culture absolutely requires him to constantly fake it until he finally makes it. Sir William subtly shifts his heavy weight to desperately relieve the agonizing pain in his completely shattered knee. His aging, thoroughly battered body is heavily covered in terrifying scars from decades of highly brutal warfare. You can clearly see the hidden, completely exhausting physical toll etched deeply into his heavily lined face. Yet he suddenly forces an incredibly bright, highly enthusiastic smile as the wealthy local lord slowly approaches. He completely buries his chronic physical agony beneath a perfectly practiced, highly artificial veneer of absolute confidence. Is this deeply depressing, profoundly fake performance truly the glorious peak of a respected knight's prestigious career? The powerful, immensely wealthy lord arrogantly tells an incredibly dull, highly offensive joke to the gathered crowd. Sir William immediately erupts into loud, completely fabricated laughter, while vigorously nodding in absolute, highly enthusiastic agreement. He desperately needs this incredibly arrogant nobleman to generously sponsor his upcoming, highly expensive summer military campaign. He violently swallows his immense personal pride just to secure another highly lucrative, desperately needed defense contract. You strictly watch this highly decorated veteran effectively reduce himself to a miserable, endlessly flattering middle manager. He aggressively flatters the wealthy elite because pure battlefield skill absolutely cannot pay his massive logistical bills. This stifling, intensely crowded banquet hall suddenly feels far more dangerous than any bloody, mud-soaked French battlefield. You suddenly realize that successfully navigating this toxic social ladder constantly requires an entirely different type of warfare. A single social misstep or an accidental insult can permanently destroy your extremely fragile, highly leveraged career. You must constantly network with incredibly arrogant people who view your entire life as a simple financial investment. The absolute physical exhaustion of wearing heavy steel armor is nothing compared to this crushing psychological burden. Why must a highly trained killer spend precious evenings aggressively kissing the rings of utterly useless aristocrats? You quietly observe Sir William gracefully offering a highly expensive cup of vintage wine to a rival commander. They exchange incredibly polite, heavily rehearsed compliments while secretly plotting to entirely destroy each other's professional reputations. This ruthless, highly sophisticated political maneuvering is the absolute dark reality of climbing the medieval corporate ladder. He casually mentions recent military victories while desperately trying to attract wealthy, highly influential financial investors today. Every single casual conversation in this sweltering, dimly lit room is actually a highly calculated, aggressive business pitch. Sir William gracefully bows his aching back again, completely sacrificing his personal dignity for a slight competitive advantage. You suddenly feel profoundly suffocated by the immense, absolutely crushing weight of all this incredibly fake, medieval socializing. The romanticized historical legends never ever mentioned the severe psychological torture of constantly begging for essential venture capital. You firmly grip your empty wooden cup while anxiously contemplating your own deeply uncertain, highly volatile financial future. You initially believed that mastering your heavy sword would automatically guarantee you immense social respect and ultimate freedom. Instead, you are permanently trapped in a highly toxic, profoundly depressing cycle of endless corporate networking banquets. But here is where it gets absolutely interesting, because the strict rules governing this bizarre behavior will shock you. You were always taught that chivalry was a beautiful, deeply poetic philosophy concerning pure honor and protecting the innocent. You probably imagine noble champions gently kissing hands and swearing holy oaths to defend the absolute weak unconditionally. But the actual historical reality of this highly famous code of conduct is completely devoid of any real romance. Chivalry was essentially an incredibly strict, highly rigid human resources manual designed for heavily armed, extremely violent private contractors. Kings and powerful church leaders desperately needed a highly reliable system to somehow control these terrifyingly dangerous killing machines. Without these strictly enforced corporate guidelines, heavily indebted medieval soldiers would simply ride around brutally robbing local defenseless farmers. They would constantly burn peaceful villages just to desperately quickly pay off their massive, completely unmanageable armor loans. No functioning civilization could possibly survive a massive roaming population of heavily armed men carrying such crushing financial debt. The glorious, heavily romanticized code of chivalry merely forced these desperate, highly trained killers to follow strict professional etiquette. Sir William continuously smiles and heavily bows today, strictly because he deeply fears a terrifying medieval version of cancel culture. If he visibly loses his aggressive temper or publicly disrespects a powerful aristocratic lord, his vital professional reputation shatters. A permanently ruined public image immediately means losing all his crucial financial sponsorships and highly lucrative military defense contracts. He is absolutely not acting politely because his noble soul is constantly filled with pure, overflowing goodness and divine light. He is maneuvering exactly like a cautious, highly stressed corporate executive, desperately trying to avoid a catastrophic public relations disaster. This strict behavioral framework ensures that powerful medieval investors can safely employ heavily armed men without facing sudden, violent mutinies. Every single romanticized rule about treating defeated noble enemies with absolute respect is basically just a strict professional courtesy protocol. You absolutely do not gracefully spare a fallen aristocratic rival out of a deep sense of beautiful human compassion. You strictly keep him alive because killing a wealthy opposing executive permanently ruins your chances of securing a massive ransom. Chivalry essentially functions as a highly sophisticated, completely ruthless mutual protection pact, strictly designed by the wealthy elite themselves. It guarantees that the incredibly wealthy nobility can wage terrible, devastating wars without personally suffering the ultimate, fatal consequences. It completely transforms a brutal, chaotic battlefield into a highly structured, heavily regulated marketplace for exchanging very valuable human assets. Why would you ever foolishly slaughter a highly valuable noble prisoner when you can comfortably hold him for extreme financial gain? This incredibly rigid, highly demanding public relations framework completely traps you inside an endless cycle of completely exhausting social performances. You must consistently project a flawless aura of absolute nobility while privately drowning in a deep sea of agonizing debt. Every single public action you take is heavily scrutinized by an incredibly unforgiving, highly competitive community of rival military contractors. Breaking these strict unwritten human resources policies completely exiles you from the highly profitable network of elite medieval society. You are ultimately a highly desperate prisoner, bound tightly by both your expensive steel armor and this suffocating corporate behavioral code. Here is where the situation gets incredibly interesting for a struggling young professional. Where exactly do you go to aggressively promote this highly demanding personal brand when there is no active war? You always imagined grand medieval tournaments as highly romantic events meant exclusively for defending a beautiful princess. The ancient legends constantly describe incredibly noble champions fighting strictly for pure honor and delicate silk favors. However, the gritty reality of the medieval joust is fundamentally a highly commercialized, extremely ruthless sporting industry. These massive public spectacles operate exactly like heavily sponsored modern athletic events designed purely for extreme profit. Desperate, heavily leveraged competitors absolutely do not risk their fragile necks just to win a lady's heart. They are heavily indebted professional athletes, violently crashing into each other strictly to win massive cash prizes. Earning absolute public glory is merely a highly convenient byproduct of successfully paying your crushing monthly bills. You desperately need this violent entertainment industry just to financially survive until the next major military campaign. Every single heavily armored pass across the dusty tilt yard represents a highly calculated brand-building exercise. You deliberately paint incredibly bright, highly recognizable heraldic symbols on your heavy wooden shield to attract sponsors. These highly vibrant personal logos function exactly like modern commercial billboards, designed to maximize public audience engagement. The screaming peasant crowds desperately want to see spectacular violence, and you provide premium medieval entertainment content. You aggressively cultivate this fierce public persona because higher visibility directly translates into highly lucrative defense contracts. Winning a prestigious local tournament instantly makes you a highly desirable asset for wealthy regional military investors. You are essentially generating massive social clout to aggressively market your highly specialized private security firm services. The ultimate financial prize actually comes from physically capturing your defeated opponent during the chaotic melee events. When you successfully knock a rival competitor off his warhorse, you legally claim his highly expensive armor. This incredibly brutal sporting economy allows struggling young professionals like yourself to temporarily escape absolute financial ruin. You can immediately pawn a defeated rival's gleaming steel breastplate to easily feed your massive hungry entourage. It is an extremely dangerous, highly volatile side hustle designed to desperately float your struggling military startup. Every spectacular victory slightly reduces the terrifying financial pressure constantly crushing your exhausted, deeply aching young shoulders. You temporarily feel a massive surge of glorious adrenaline as the cheering crowd loudly screams your name. But this highly entertaining sporting game quickly ends when the trumpet of real war finally sounds. The loud, blaring trumpet completely shatters your brief, highly comforting illusion of commercial sporting glory. You are immediately thrust into a thoroughly miserable, seemingly endless military march across a devastated, completely barren countryside. The heavily romanticized image of proud knights riding majestically under bright, colorful banners vanishes instantly. A relentless, freezing rain begins to pour continuously from a deeply depressing, solid, completely featureless gray sky. It violently lashes against your exhausted face and deeply penetrates every single layer of your heavy woolen clothing. You are brutally forced to ride your highly uncomfortable palfrey horse for countless, agonizingly long daily hours. Your incredibly expensive, highly prized warhorse is carefully and anxiously led safely behind you to strictly conserve energy. The poorly maintained dirt roads quickly turn into deep, highly treacherous rivers of thick, clinging brown sludge. Every single mile traveled deeply feels like an absolute eternity of pure, unadulterated physical and mental misery. The continuous, aggressively driving rain quickly becomes your absolute most hated, relentlessly cruel daily enemy on this brutal journey. Freezing water easily seeps through the tiny gaps in your heavy canvas luggage, completely soaking your meager sleeping supplies. You must constantly obsessively polish your incredibly expensive steel armor every night to aggressively fight off spreading rust. If you lazily neglect this utterly exhausting daily chore, your massive financial investment will completely, irreversibly deteriorate. Your aching hands are permanently blistered and heavily stained black from constantly rubbing foul-smelling oils onto cold steel. You routinely sleep sitting rigidly upright in the freezing mud because your soaked tent provides absolutely zero real warmth. The deeply pervasive damp cold violently seeps directly into your violently shivering, thoroughly exhausted and aching bones. It makes every single morning a completely agonizing physical nightmare as you painfully force stiff joints to move. Do you ever genuinely wonder how many proud, heavily armed knights quietly died from simple exposure before combat? The massive, highly complex logistical train that previously demanded your money now completely drains your remaining mental sanity. Your heavily burdened, thoroughly exhausted pack mules constantly slip and dangerously fall in the deep, treacherous roadside ditches. You must frequently and personally wade directly into the freezing, waist-deep mud to desperately push heavy wooden carts. Your highly expensive, strictly heavily imported warhorse suddenly develops a terrifying, chest-rattling cough in this thoroughly miserable weather. You completely panic, instantly visualizing your entire heavily leveraged financial future dying quietly on the side of a dirt road. You generously share your own highly limited, heavily rationed dry food with the sick beast just to keep it alive. Your deeply exhausted, profoundly miserable servants constantly complain bitterly about the freezing rain and their rapidly shrinking daily rations. You are hopelessly trapped in an incredibly slow-moving, deeply depressing caravan of pure suffering and completely endless exhaustion. The deeply miserable days seamlessly blur together into one continuous, highly monotonous loop of endless walking and freezing rain. You completely lose track of time, focusing entirely on simply surviving until the next absolutely miserable muddy campsite. There are absolutely no beautiful maidens playfully throwing colorful sweet flowers from high romantic castle balconies out here. There is only the agonizing, highly rhythmic squelching of thousands of heavy boots violently tearing up the ruined earth. You chew mechanically on rock-hard, heavily salted dried meat that desperately requires hours of highly aggressive, painful chewing. Exhausted mind violently swings between deep, crushing depression and overwhelming anxiety about your rapidly compounding financial debts. The glorious, deeply noble crusader you once vividly imagined is now just a filthy, desperately tired man covered in mud. You smell absolutely terrible. Your muscles scream in agony, and you severely question every single life choice you made. But the real, terrifying nightmare of this grueling military campaign is waiting quietly just ahead in the dark. You finally reach the massive military encampment after weeks of agonizingly brutal marching across the country. The glorious battlefield you constantly dreamed about is actually just a sprawling, intensely muddy, chaotic slum. Thousands of filthy canvas tents are crammed tightly together across a deeply scarred, completely ruined landscape. There are absolutely no beautiful choirs singing majestic hymns of holy victory in this highly depressing place. Instead, the heavy, damp air is completely filled with the terrifying sounds of violent, uncontrollable human coughing. A deeply revolting stench of rotting garbage and raw human waste constantly burns your severely tired throat. This stagnant, horribly contaminated living environment is secretly more lethal than any sharpened enemy steel sword. You desperately try to breathe shallowly while carefully navigating the treacherous, deeply rutted dirt paths around you. Every single step exposes you to microscopic threats that no heavy steel armor can ever successfully block. The absolute greatest threat to your highly leveraged military career is completely invisible to the naked eye. A devastating wave of severe dysentery sweeps mercilessly through the densely packed, highly unsanitary dirt camp daily. You watch incredibly strong, highly trained veteran knights collapsing helplessly outside their damp canvas sleeping tents. They are violently purging bodily fluids until their heavily muscled bodies completely wither into absolutely nothing. This terrifying sickness represents the absolute worst nightmare for an independent medieval military contractor like yourself. Falling violently ill means immediately losing your crucial physical ability to actually perform dangerous, highly profitable labor. If you cannot stand up and effectively fight tomorrow, you cannot possibly capture a wealthy, noble prisoner. Without that desperately needed ransom money, your entire fragile financial empire will instantly and permanently completely collapse. Can you realistically afford to lose your entire family estate just because you accidentally drank tainted water? You slowly walk past the overcrowded medical tents and hear the agonizing groans of slowly dying men. The highly inexperienced camp surgeons possess absolutely no real understanding of basic human hygiene or proper sanitation. They casually attempt to treat severe intestinal infections by brutally bleeding, heavily exhausted, already severely dehydrated soldiers. You deeply realize that surviving this terrifying medical ordeal relies entirely upon incredibly blind, pure, dumb luck. A simple sip from the wrong wooden bucket could easily destroy your massive upfront financial investment completely. You essentially gamble your entire highly leveraged future every single time you eat poorly cooked camp meat. The constant, overwhelming fear of sudden physical incapacitation continuously gnaws at your rapidly deteriorating mental health daily. You are heavily surrounded by legendary champions who are currently dying incredibly pathetic, highly undignified, muddy deaths. Their incredibly expensive, highly polished armor sits completely uselessly, while their frail biological bodies completely fail them. The psychological torture of endlessly waiting for the inevitable battle slowly breaks the strongest professional medieval warriors. You spend countless agonizing hours desperately sharpening your incredibly expensive sword to simply distract your anxious mind. Every sudden trumpet blast from the distant enemy camp sends a terrifying shockwave of pure adrenaline through you. The intense, suffocating pressure of impending lethal violence constantly forces your heart to beat aggressively fast, continuously. You repeatedly, meticulously inspect every single leather strap on your heavy steel armor for any fatal structural flaws. Men constantly write desperate last wills while nervously praying for divine protection from the looming bloody slaughter. Will your heavily mortgaged combat equipment actually save your fragile life when the brutal chaos finally erupts? The incredibly thick fog slowly descends over the silent camp as the terrifyingly long night finally approaches you. You lie awake staring blankly at the dark canvas ceiling while nervously listening to distant enemy troop movements. Sleep is absolutely impossible when your heavily indebted mind constantly races with terrifying apocalyptic combat scenarios. Your severely exhausted squire quietly wakes you hours before the cold sun even attempts to finally rise. The surrounding military camp is completely covered in a deeply chilling, intensely thick blanket of freezing mist. Men silently begin the incredibly tedious, highly agonizing process of strapping themselves into their heavy metal coffins. Nobody speaks a single word, because the overwhelming reality of imminent death completely silences the entire army. You forcefully swallow a few bites of stale bread down your extremely dry, violently tight, nervous throat. The distant, terrifying sound of massive enemy war drums suddenly begins to echo across the ruined valley. You take one final, deeply trembling breath of foul-smelling air before moving toward the gathering military formation. The decisive morning has finally arrived, and you slowly step out onto the highly dangerous front lines. The massive steel lines finally crash together violently. Deafening thunder completely shatters the freezing morning air. You immediately push forward into the terrifying metal grinder. Thousands of screaming men blindly smash into each other now. Heavy wooden lances instantly shatter into very sharp, flying splinters. Your massive warhorse violently slams against their painted wooden shields. The pure physical impact aggressively shakes your exhausted bones deeply. You wildly swing your heavy sword in pure frantic desperation. Sparks fly brightly as cheap iron heavily strikes tempered steel. Thick mud violently splashes across your incredibly narrow helmet visor. You can barely breathe inside this chaotic, deadly crushing mob. Pure adrenaline completely floods your severely exhausted, heavily armored body. You suddenly spot a wealthy noble wearing highly decorated armor. He is aggressively fighting just 20 feet away from you. A common foot soldier strictly wants to kill him quickly. But you absolutely cannot ever afford to murder this man. That wealthy aristocrat is your absolute golden lottery ticket today. He represents the ultimate solution to your massive financial debt. Killing him instantly destroys your only real chance at freedom. You must somehow capture this dangerous enemy noble completely alive. This entire bloody battlefield is basically a massive violent kidnapping. You are desperately hunting a highly valuable human hostage here. Every weapon swing must perfectly incapacitate without causing fatal damage. You strictly must knock him unconscious to claim his ransom. You aggressively steer your heavy horse toward the shining target. Cheap enemy swords violently scrape against your expensive steel plates. You completely ignore the entirely worthless foot soldiers around you. They offer absolutely zero financial return on this deadly investment. Your complete focus remains strictly locked on the rich prize. He turns swiftly and fiercely raises his own heavy weapon. You intentionally reverse your sharp sword quickly in your hand. The deadly steel blade is completely useless for this transaction. You firmly grab the blade to use the heavy pommel. You swing aggressively directly at his brightly painted steel helmet. A fatal strike completely ruins your highly anticipated massive payday. You just need to rattle his noble brain hard enough. The heavy steel pommel connects with a truly sickening crunch. The wealthy lord slumps heavily over his expensive leather saddle. You quickly grab his horse before he completely falls down. This unconscious body instantly pays off your entire family mortgage. Pure euphoria briefly washes over your completely exhausted, stressed mind. You finally secured the ultimate financial bag in this chaos. But protecting your highly valuable new prize is incredibly difficult. You must physically drag him backward through this brutal meat grinder. Other desperate knights actively want to steal your wealthy captive. The chaotic battlefield becomes a vicious, bloody fight over money. You urgently pull his captured horse toward the safe rear. The muddy ground beneath you suddenly gives way entirely to day. Your heavy warhorse violently stumbles deeply in the thick sludge. You are violently thrown from your highly elevated leather saddle. The narrow slit of your visor offers only a fractured, bouncing view of the slaughter unfolding around you. This is the terrifying tunnel vision of absolute physical exhaustion. You desperately try to pull fresh air into your burning lungs, but the rigid chest plate restricts your expanding ribs. The 55 pounds of custom-fitted steel, purchased with borrowed money and false promises of glory, suddenly feels alien. It is no longer a shining symbol of your elevated status or a protective shell. It has transformed into a suffocating, heavy burden, dragging you downward into the unforgiving earth. You try to roll your body over to at least expose your face to the open sky. But the heavy plate armor, perfectly designed to deflect crushing blows from swords and axes, now pins your shoulders directly to the earth. The sticky, dense mud acts exactly like a vacuum, sucking the smooth steel down with an inescapable, terrifying force. You realize with a sickening jolt that you're completely trapped inside your own expensive investment. The shiny metallic suit you mortgaged your entire future to acquire is now actively pulling you into the grave. But the real danger you soon discover is not the enemy army surrounding you. The enemy knight who knocked you down does not even bother to deliver a finishing blow. He simply walks away, leaving the brutal environment to finish the miserable job for him. You are left entirely alone in the deafening chaos, fighting a solitary, pathetic battle against the soft, wet earth. The filthy water and thick mud begin to seep slowly through the narrow breathing holes of your steel visor. You violently jerk your head side to side, but the heavy helmet is driven further down into the suffocating mire. You are actually going to drown in 4 inches of water. The sheer absurdity of the grim situation is eclipsed only by the raw, animalistic terror gripping your tightening chest. You cannot physically reach your own face to wipe away the thick sludge filling your nose and mouth. Your expensive gauntlets claw uselessly at the slippery mud, finding absolutely nothing solid to grip onto. This is not the glorious, heroic death you envisioned when you confidently signed those heavy debt papers. There are no singing angels, no weeping maidens, and no honorable final words spoken to a trusted comrade. There is only the wet, suffocating darkness closing in rapidly around your panicked eyes. You are literally drowning on dry land, crushed under the immense, unyielding weight of your own worldly ambitions. The armor serves as a perfect, brutal metaphor for the modern tragedy of ultimate burnout. You climbed the unforgiving social ladder, acquired the heavy title, and wore the expensive uniform of success. Yet those exact same things became the rigid, inflexible trap that eventually suffocated the life right out of you. Your ragged, desperate breaths bubble pathetically through the thick mud, slowly filling your steel cage. The loud sounds of clashing swords and screaming men above you slowly become muffled, distant, and finally completely insignificant. The extreme heat stroke finally shuts down your boiling brain, offering a strange, terrifying mercy in the absolute pitch blackness. The heavy steel coffin, your ultimate symbol of hard-won success, finally sinks silently into the unforgiving medieval mud. The chaotic, deafening thunder of brutal combat eventually fades into a chilling absolute silence across the bloodied valley. You slowly open your tired eyes and gently push yourself out of the cold, violently clinging medieval mud. The terrifying battle is officially over, leaving behind a devastated landscape filled with physically deeply broken men. Survivors wander aimlessly through the thick fog like silent ghosts searching desperately for their completely lost human souls. They slowly strip valuable steel armor from fallen comrades without displaying any visible traces of genuine human emotion. This incredibly bleak, deeply depressing scene perfectly captures the absolute cold reality of the brutal medieval military industry. There is no glorious heavenly choir singing joyful victory anthems to celebrate the completely exhausted surviving warriors. There is only the sharp, distinctly metallic sound of desperate survivors meticulously counting their newly acquired financial profits. The physical fighting completely stops, but the ruthless, highly calculating economic warfare immediately shifts into a higher gear. If you successfully dragged an unconscious noble across the muddy field, your financial destiny changes almost instantly today. You effectively secured the absolute highest tier of the medieval equivalent to the glorious, highly idealized American dream. That incredibly wealthy captive sitting miserably inside your damp canvas tent is literally a massive winning lottery ticket. His desperate family will quickly pay exorbitant amounts of pure silver just to guarantee his absolutely safe return. You can finally wipe out that absolutely crushing mountain of heavy debt you originally accumulated buying your armor. You will eventually return to your obscure village as a highly respected, immensely wealthy, completely independent military contractor. Your highly successful violent startup venture finally achieved the massive financial payout you constantly and aggressively prayed for. You can comfortably buy extremely fertile land, build a strong stone manor, and completely establish a powerful legacy. This extreme financial mobility is exactly why so many desperate young men willingly risk drowning in the mud. However, if you are unfortunately sitting quietly inside an enemy tent, your entire existence is completely destroyed. Being captured alive by a rival knight immediately triggers an absolute, highly catastrophic financial collapse for your immediate family. A cold, highly formal ransom letter will be swiftly dispatched directly to your terrified, heavily weeping, desperate elderly parents. They will absolutely have to ruthlessly liquidate every single valuable asset your family cautiously accumulated over several generations. Your incredibly desperate father will forcefully sell his highly fertile ancestral farmlands for mere pennies on the dollar. Your proud family will be suddenly thrust into absolute, deeply humiliating peasant poverty just to simply buy your life. You survive the terrifying physical battle only to ultimately return home to a financially ruined, heavily devastated household. Was surviving that brutal clash of steel actually worth utterly destroying your entire family's completely fragile financial future? The glorious quest for noble honor quickly transforms into a deeply toxic, highly destructive, completely inescapable generational debt trap. You sit exhausted on a broken cart and heavily contemplate this incredibly ruthless, highly violent medieval economy. The shiny steel armor is definitely not a symbol of justice, but merely a precise tool for wealth extraction. Rich aristocrats continuously aggressively trade massive piles of silver, while extremely poor soldiers slowly and quietly bleed out. This endless, highly destructive cycle of extreme violence and ransom exclusively benefits the absolute highest tier of society. You finally realize that this entire majestic war is essentially just a massive, completely rigged, highly corrupt financial machine. The desperate winners merely steal enough temporary wealth to survive until the next inevitable bloody conflict formally starts. The tragic losers lose absolutely everything they own, permanently falling into the massive underclass of forgotten peasants. There is no profound moral lesson to be miraculously discovered in this highly depressing, completely empty, muddy field. There is merely the incredibly harsh, deeply cold reality of extreme medieval survival in a highly transactional, unforgiving world. But the real secret is that this crushing realization prepares you for the ultimate truth about these famous legends. We carefully created these highly romanticized stories to deliberately hide a profoundly dark and brutal historical reality. The beautiful, enchanting legends of King Arthur were written long after the real armored warriors actually perished. You'd naturally prefer watching a completely spotless champion bravely rescuing a perfectly clean, highly grateful, beautiful princess. Nobody truly wants to watch a deeply depressed soldier desperately calculating his massive armor loan interest rates. We willingly accept this highly comforting illusion because the unvarnished historical truth is simply too deeply depressing. When you truly understand their agonizing daily struggles, you develop a profound sense of genuine human empathy. These famous historical figures were absolutely not mythical demigods, possessing completely pure and entirely flawless moral characters. These highly entertaining fictional stories completely scrubbed away the freezing mud and the deeply crushing financial debt. Their incredibly heavy, shining steel armor was essentially just a highly dangerous uniform for a difficult job. They aggressively fought to simply protect their fragile families from absolute, completely devastating generational peasant poverty. Understanding their profound daily misery actually makes their remarkable physical endurance seem significantly more genuinely highly impressive. You finally realize that they were simply trying to survive another deeply miserable day in the mud. The modern American landscape has ultimately replaced blood-soaked battlefields with brightly lit, highly competitive corporate office spaces. Yet the deeply exhausting psychological pressure to constantly perform and aggressively climb the social ladder remains identical. You must still navigate highly toxic networking events and desperately hide your own profound personal, professional anxieties. We still aggressively chase incredibly expensive status symbols to successfully project an illusion of complete financial stability. That highly expensive tailored corporate suit you wear perhaps shares a massive psychological weight with iron armor. Both garments are carefully designed to project absolute strength while secretly hiding a deeply exhausted human being. Thank you for peacefully joining me on this deeply reflective historical journey through the brutal medieval past. I sincerely wish you a very calm, completely peaceful, and truly deeply restful good night safely tonight.